Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different, which is to react to a comment that was placed on a thread to a recent interview I did with Emerson Green. It was on his channel and he kindly allowed me to mirror the interview on my channel, so we have this reciprocal agreement. And this is a comment from a chap called John Nairich, who put quite a lot of effort and thought into a comment. And I often think, and I know this from having written 4,500 plus blog posts and articles on different places, that, and sometimes you get like a thread of 1,000 comments literally on a single piece, and you think they're going to be often lost, some of those really thoughtful comments lost to the annals of time. And in fact, with Patheos closing down the non-religious channel and taking all the articles off, luckily they were migrated to my present home at Only Sky, but there were literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of comments that have now disappeared forever. All that effort people put in, all the arguments, the debates, just the time put into those comment threads to think that they are gone is quite sad. Anyway, here's a comment that's roughly to do with the problem of evil and miracles. I've skim read it and I thought, right, I'm going to just react to this. So actually what's going to take place now will be a stream of consciousness. Apologize for that. If you don't like it, meh. If you do, cool. So here it is. So what does John have to say? Jonathan, I think there is also the problem of miracles, somewhat akin, somewhat the antithesis to the problem of evil. In one case, God should be blamed for either tolerating evil or actively causing it. In the other, while God can step forward and do something good, this also results in plenty of cases where he chooses not to. In both cases, God is okay with the very uneven distribution of good and bad things, his taking actions which don't seem to relate to how good the recipients are or aren't, nor to how much they pray or are prayed for. This is a really good point. It's the opening paragraph here. So I talk about this a lot in my book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, which is to say that there is this uneven distribution of an awful lot of stuff. In fact, in virtually everything God does, God is unfair. People are given advantage or disadvantage over an awful lot of things. You can talk about, as John does here, evil and suffering. And that's true. Some people, some babies get cancer and die before they're 6 months old. And other people live to 100 and all the values in between and more than 100. And with that, you get a completely uneven distribution of goodness of what and behavior, so that someone that's been perfectly good and nice can end up getting hit by a bus at 12, and someone who's properly evil can live to 100 and do 100 years of evil things. And likewise, and I talk about this a lot in 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, likewise there's the uneven distribution of evidence for God. So you get Jesus' followers getting to see firsthand loads of miracles, and then someone 2,000 years later living in, I don't know, Riyadh, are they going to have much chance of accessing the gospel? And then you have people born in the Amazonian rainforest in 3000 BC. Are they going to have a chance of accessing the gospel? And so on and so forth. So you just have this entirely unfair distribution of everything, of health, of knowledge, of theology, of evidence, of goodness, of badness, of being prayed for. Some people are not prayed for at all and would deserve it heaps more than other people who are prayed for, and so on and so forth. So it's just a complete mix. Now, if God was truly all-loving, this should be completely fair, but none of this is fair. Now, there's a counter-argument to say that pure fairness will look like homogeneity, so everyone will be absolutely identical, in which case we'd all have exactly the same access to everything. Equality of opportunity would be evident right across society and across time. And so you could say, well, in order to avoid that kind of society that might have its own load of problems, if everyone was the same and had the same opportunity to everything, then things would just, it would be some kind of robotic nightmare, maybe. So there are counter arguments going on here, but at the very least, it looks like God is certainly unfair to a large extent. Now, theists often come back with, well, it all gets, equaled up in heaven and hell. So if the 6-month-old baby, dies of cancer, then it's okay because it'll live eternally in hell. But then all you're doing is you're compensating that baby. It's not moral justification. I've talked about this previously, which is to say that it doesn't make it good that the baby dies of cancer. It suddenly isn't good just because they go to heaven for eternity, unless you believe in a strict form of moral consequentialism, which theists, believers generally don't. So generally, this is compensation, not moral justification. If your house gets destroyed in someone setting fire to it, arson, right? You getting compensated by the insurance company doesn't make that a good thing that's happened. You'd rather it didn't happen, right? And so there's, and all analogies are limited, but there's an analogy to show that that's compensation, not moral justification. It doesn't make what the arsonist did a good thing, right? Unless, as I say, you believe in some strict form of consequentialism. So, God is responsible, ultimately responsible for everything. And so, absolutely, John, totally in agreement so far. I saw Derek and Paulogia debate a couple of Christians recently. Part of the discussion was about the likeliness of supernatural events. One of the Christians said he was compiling a list of all known miracles to show that, yes, miracles were both possible and likely. But this got me to thinking. I haven't seen his list, but I'm sure he has lots of trivial things like a weeping statue, Christ's face on a piece of toast, or Mike Lacona's flying garbage can lids. Many of these on this list I can imagine are more of God just showing off than actually accomplishing good, like Jesus turning water into wine. God comes across more as a Loki than a heavenly Florence Nightingale. So this is a really good point again, which is that, this is an abductive argument, which is if you believed in an all-loving God, an omni-God, right, and you accepted that God was likely to do miracles, then what would be the sort of miracles you would predict? It would be getting people off the hook who were in terrible situations, saving people from a tsunami, all these big things, or even little things that were meaningful, not these random sort of miracles that don't appear to be particularly meaningful. But also a lot of these miracles look very much like naturalistic things anyway. So the argument against miracles is often God doesn't grow back amputees' arms and legs. And yes, this is a really powerful argument in my opinion, which is that almost all miracles look very much like something that can happen naturally anyway. The remission of cancer. Yeah, they were prayed for, but what about all the people that were prayed for whose cancer didn't go into remission? Okay, so we counting the hits, ignoring the misses. And never ignore the misses. It's bad. And then, so, yeah, I think the whole discussion of miracles is fraught with problem as far as certainly the Christian is concerned. And God does look like he's just poking around doing random insignificant stuff when there is so much out there that could be acted upon. And it goes back to what would you predict? And an abductive argument say, what does the data better support? In this case, the hypothesis of omni-God theism or naturalistic atheism. Well, these kind of half-assed slapdash miracles would support that happen in all religions. So there's a plurality plurality problem here. This in my opinion, would better support naturalistic atheism, doesn't support omnigod theism, and that's a problem. And I think, you know, John is making another good point in his second paragraph. So we move on to his third paragraph. Miracles fall into two categories: the natural ones, that's what I was talking about, and the magical ones. If someone prays for dollars for rent and then wins the lottery, this is a matter of percentages, not a bending of the laws of physics. A believer may be convinced this is God's handiwork, but coincidences happen all the time. 10,000 people who did not win the lottery do not add this to their tally of all the times that God doesn't respond. Only the hits counted. Exactly what I was saying. And in fact, you can give a very good account of just natural occurrences representing what people think are miracles for a vast majority of miracle claims, if not all, apart from certainly the natural ones, right? So coincidences happen, and in fact there's something called Littlewood's law. Littlewood's law, Littlewood was a mathematician. He said basically if you say think of a miracle as something with incredibly low probability, 1 in a million, say, then, you know, you think, wow, this incredible thing happens. For example, someone praying for someone who has cancer and their cancer going into remission. Wow, this is incredible. Okay, so let's say that naturalistically that's a 1 in a million chance. The thing is that in a month, easily a million things happen to you, right? So what that means is, you know, think of all the things that you do every day, every bit of stimuli that's, you know, that you are involved in, that you're observing, etc., etc., etc. What happens is, you know, like with the lottery, if you've got 1 in 15 million chance of winning the lottery and you buy 15 million tickets, you're probably going to win the lottery. So with these kind of really low probability events, if they're 1 in a million chance of happening, but you're doing a million things a month, then you're going to have a really low probability of event happening once a month. So he did the maths on that, and he's like, basically, all this stuff is going to happen all the time to everyone. We're just doing so much stuff that really low probability things are going to happen an awful lot on a very regular occurrence. So there you go. That's exactly what John is saying here. And he continues, on the other hand, if instead of beating the odds with a natural win, money simply rains down out of the sky, so these are your supernatural ones, this might be a magical miracle. At least until you hear about an armoured Wells Fargo plane that blew up overhead. Many times magical miracles are simply due to our lack of understanding. Interesting point here. The unexplainable often yields to scientific explanations in the long run as science continues to advance. And this is the idea that initially you might think, wow, this really truly is incredible. So for example, you know, imagine someone grew back a limb. And we thought that's a miracle. Well, it could be that there's some weird and wonderful naturalistic explanation to that we just don't yet understand. And so what happens is people too quickly punt to God as an explanation rather than just holding back and thinking, actually, what else could explain this? Now, of course, that is a pretty big one to explain, but that hasn't happened, right? It just hasn't happened. There's one miracle claim. I debated miracles with Caleb Jackson on Myth Vision, and he brought up this miracle claim from hundreds of years ago of an amputee whose leg apparently grew back, but it's so bad and it's been debunked completely. Yeah. So really, there is no decent claim of anything like that happening to humans. So John continues. There is an overall question about why an all-powerful God would need to step outside the laws of nature, his laws of nature that supposedly he set up, in order to accomplish an extraordinary thing that he wants. Also, God should have seen any need to act way back during the trillions of years he sat in the dark before he realized he could create light. Okay, first of all, he wasn't sitting for trillions of years. So I'll disagree on a point here, but it's just a minor kind of philosophical point. And even William Lane Craig would agree with this, that when God created the universe, God created space-time. And so therefore, time literally didn't exist until God created time. And then in creating time, God enters into time. Now, not all theologians will believe this, but it is, I think, pretty mainstream. In other words, in God world, there was no time. Now, this creates loads of problems. I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but I easily could. Because it appears that, certainly as we understand it, causality needs time. There's a sequential aspect to causality, which means that, when you do something at this point, it causes something at the next point in time. Now, if you don't have time, arguably you can't have causality, which means God can't cause the universe to exist, God can't create the universe because there is no time. So that's an interesting argument there. Also the idea that God doesn't have personhood, just existing not in time, just exists as someone, supposedly an entity, a person, that exists with all the characteristics of personhood, and yet you only have one instance. There's no temporal aspect to God's existence, so you can't think, you can't deliberate, you can't do anything that takes time. So God choosing to do something isn't God choosing. When we as humans, what we understand by choice is, let's think about those options. I'm going to go for that one, right? You have an array of options and you eventually choose one option by deliberating over it and having some rationale behind the choice. If God can't do that, there's just nothing and then something, or there's just God world and then God world plus the universe. So in creating the universe, it's just an instant. There's no choice, there's no decision. It just, one can argue, necessarily emanates from God. You could argue that the universe is just as necessary as God, because God existed, the universe existed, there's no time difference, it's just... So this is why often theologians and Christian philosophers will say, because they can't say before the universe God existed, because before the universe, that's saying before time. You can't use a temporal connective before when comparing a tensed time frame to a non-temporal scenario. So they often say, instead of saying before, they say causally prior to. But then this invites a problem of like, well, how does causality exist without time? So yeah, loads of issues there, but that's a complete rabbit hole. But the point is this, is that God in advance should have known what was going to happen, so didn't need to get involved with miracles. It's almost like oh dear, I need to get in and act. I didn't see that coming. It is a bit, the whole Noah's Ark story is a bit like this. It's like, I didn't predict that humans are going to be this rubbish. Let's clear the table and start again. And there's a lot of this going on. Yeah, every time that God interacts with humanity in miraculous ways, it appears very ad hoc, and it appears like, God is reacting to something that he hadn't foreseen. Or if he had foreseen it, he could have designed it in another way. If that's something he didn't want to happen, has to step in to change it, then actually, what does that say about his design and creation abilities? So yeah, it's really good stuff that John's coming out with. This is the sort of stuff I love thinking about. For instance, instead of parting the Red Sea in his best Cecil B. DeMille style, God could have had the volcano on the island of Crete collapse and then explode and accomplish the same thing naturally. But he also could have had the Pharaoh suffer a stroke at a convenient time, or not have hardened Pharaoh's heart in the first place, who then might have shown mercy. Even better, steer the ancestors of the Hebrew slaves away from getting into bondage in the first place. Absolutely agree with all of these points. It's just absolutely spot on. And it's using people instrumentally. I mean, this is kind of utilitarianism, which Christians hate, right? Because you don't need God for that moral value system. But it appears that God is using people in order to get a greater good. So he's using this whole scenario to tell a story, to create a narrative that gives identity to the Hebrew people. But that's like killing people for the end. That's just using people in the most terminal way in order to get some great story that's lovely for his people. And it's horrible. I mean, he could have done that, and one could imagine it in so much more benevolent a way. than that. And John, presents a couple of options here. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart is really interesting, and I've written extensively on that in a book that is stalled at the moment because of my co-author's not very well. But a book on the Exodus I've been writing for some time, and there's a whole big bit on the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And in my free will book, I write on that as well, because it's a real problem. And I think the exegesis that Christians and Jews come up with to claim that God's not really hardening his heart, or it really is the Pharaoh's fault, is really problematic. And at the end of the day, the only way of making sense of that claim is that the only reason you would say God hardens Pharaoh's heart is if that had some causal efficacy, right? Otherwise, what's the point of saying that? And it also shows that God didn't know what Pharaoh would do, so had to harden his heart just in case. Or God knew he was going to say yes, so harden his heart to say no. There is no other way of understanding this, despite the hoops that particularly Christians jump through. So yeah, again, really good points. Okay, so far I haven't touched on the problem. Okay, lots of talk already. We haven't even got to the problem. If God was like Robin Hood or the Scarlet Pimpernel, only able to do miracles in a limited fashion, I'm not sure they were able to do miracles, acting in the context of a hostile environment, one could accept God's hit or miss tricks, but supposedly God owns all this entire universe and can do whatever he wants. Yeah, and quite often you hear some apologists sort of limit God's ability. So I remember arguing personally with Dinesh D'Souza in an email back and forth I had with him. This is years ago, probably a decade ago, where he was talking about something, and I called him out, and it was to do with like plate tectonics and that, and death of say for example 2004 tsunami. Why would God let that happen? And he was arguing, well, plate tectonics are necessary for life, and if you didn't have plate tectonics, you couldn't have life. And it's like, so you're saying God was constrained in such a way that he could only create life by using plate tectonics, or that he couldn't do perpetual miracles to stop these terrible things happening at any given time? Like his omnipotence is that constrained? It's absolute nonsense. So yeah, God can do whatever God wants. And so limiting God by saying, you can only work in this context or in this framework is limiting God unnecessarily. So John continues, one might argue that God does miracles in order to draw attention to himself, sort of like signing his work. That is, after all, how the Bible explains the need for all the plagues of Moses. Yeah, so this is all about power. This is it's quite explicit in the Exodus accounts, which is he is showing his power. Now, the irony here, the terrible irony, is horrible, because all the firstborn children in Egypt die, in the whole nation of Egypt, literally all of them. It's very explicit. All of them die. And all the animals and terrible, terrible things. The 10 plagues is one of the most disgusting stories in the Bible. It's absolutely horrible. Go and read it. Read it and actually think about the morality of it. It is a terrible, terrible story. It's all about God saying, hey, look how powerful I am. You should believe in me. And as I say, the terrible irony is that the Egyptians didn't. All this happened to the Egyptians. And then to a man, woman and child, the Egyptians didn't believe in Yahweh. They're like, well, there's no example of Yahwism, of Judaism in Egypt until it depends how you date the story, right? But if you date it as Christians claim, then there's no evidence of Hebrews or Jews being in Egypt until 600 years later, and even then they're diaspora, so they're not Egyptian people. The Egyptians didn't believe in Judaism. What a failure! What a failure of look how powerful I am. I can do all this to you guys, and the Egyptians are like, this is terrible. This is terrible. Oh my God! Look, God, literally doing stuff to us. We all understand this is God doing all this terrible stuff. Oh, let's not believe in him. Literally a week later, they're all like, oh, that was a bad week, wasn't it? Yeah. How did that happen? Well, I don't know. It's just, because it's just a myth, right? and they don't have to think about these things. So John continues, one might argue that God, I've just said that. And yes, God supposedly doing good Exodus type stuff for his own people resulted in a lot more terrible things for the ordinary Egyptian citizens, as I just discussed, people who had nothing to do with Pharaoh's rules. The overall balance sheet seems incredibly negative in this regard. Yeah, this is absolutely true. And the fact that children can be murdered on account of Pharaoh saying no when Pharaoh's own heart was hardened is just a prime example of God's moral abhorrence. Absolutely, I'm not having it. It's a terrible story. John continues, so when some theist gushes over how wonderful God is by letting said believer miraculously find his car keys, this is the same God that gave a child cancer, and also the same God that didn't perform a miraculous cure despite all the prayers. With all the supposed power to affect things in a positive manner comes the added blame when one doesn't do this to the extent of their ability. I'm just realizing, have I not done a video on this? I've written a piece on this, and I may have included it in one of my books. It might be in here, actually. The argument from sporadic miracles. So the fact that God picks and chooses miracles in such a way that's completely unfair, like God can supposedly find someone's keys, but can't stop 230,000 people dying in a tsunami, this kind of stuff, or like some quadriplegic can now walk because he is prayed for, and yet all these millions of people who were also prayed for have still got debilitating illnesses. It's an argument against God. So where Christians go, look, this is proof of God, and they show like one isolated miracle, I would say that one isolated miracle is evidence that God doesn't exist, because it shows God to be incredibly unfair and unloving. You know, if you walk past a river where someone's drowning and you are able to pull them out, but just look at them and then walk on, you are culpable for their death. If you could help, but don't. So, I would say sporadic miracles, and I think that's what John's really getting at here. And I would push you toward my piece on sporadic miracles. I'll try and link it below. Yeah, if I haven't done a video, I'll look back at because I forget my MS brain. I forget, what I've done and what I haven't done. But if I haven't done it, I'll do a video on that, but basically sporadic miracles is an argument against God, not an argument for God. As he finishes, yet the paradox is also that if you condemn God for miracles because they are so uneven and haphazard, miracles are supposedly the only way we are supposed to really see the ongoing glory of God. Take them away and God has no power to affect us in this life. Well, of course, yeah, because God, anytime God interacts with this life, it's miraculous, right? Because it's kind of breaking the physical laws. Otherwise, you just let everything go as it would. So any interaction of God is miraculous. And so that is how, definitely how God shows power, but also how we see the ongoing glory of God, as John says. Just unless you are going to mete out your miracles evenly, then you are being unfair, and that you have to create some theodicy as to why that is so. It is just another iteration of the problem of evil, just from a different, it's like God directly creating that evil, that suffering, or the not good, if you like. So it's a way that you can formulate the problem of evil, but directly attach it to God's own behavior. And I think it's a huge problem. This is a really good comment, and I've enjoyed thinking about that. There's all the stuff I love thinking about, and I really hadn't read this. I'd skim read it, but I hadn't really read it. I thought, right, I'm going to leave that to this video. So none of this is prepared. So sorry if this is just all nonsense stream of consciousness, but that's how I roll. I like it. Good stuff. Bring it on. Keep them coming. I hope that was useful or interesting, or if not, I hope it enabled you to get sleep or something. As ever, as ever, please like, subscribe. You can join, you can give thanks to this video, all those things if you have disposable income and you are willing and able. That's obviously hugely appreciated. But personally, question everything, particularly yourselves, because you are the easiest person to fool with your own thinking. Toodle bits.